My mom died recently. She was out for one of her nightly walks along the woods near her house and got hit by a speeding car. The car was going so fast that she flew 30 feet in the air and skidded on the gravel road for 10 more. She was dead at the moment of impact. When the police showed up at my house hours later and informed me, I collapsed and slammed my head on the door frame on the way down. 10 stitches and a dead mom, a banger of an evening. They never found the driver that did it. Dealing with Mom's sudden and tragic death was the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with. I was a mess for weeks and still go through waves of grief. Her passing was a profound loss, and I feel it in my soul. There will never be another woman like her, and all I can do is strive to be a tenth of the person she was. As emotionally hard as the funeral was, it didn't hold a candle to going to her home and sorting out her things. That was gut punch after gut punch until I had to stop and take a break. When you have free reign in someone's house and can search every nook and cranny, you discover the person they hid from the world. Everyone has secrets, and my mom was no exception. I was cleaning out her attic when I came across a small wooden box tucked away in the corner. I'd never seen it before, but it was beautiful. It was a little larger than a jewelry box, but what made it beautiful was the designs cut into the box itself. The four corners were some of the most complex geometric designs I've ever seen in any medium, let alone carved wood. The front of the box had what looked like an old English script with the word focus carved around the keyhole. The top of the box looked like an old-world woodcut picture of several robed figures standing around a campfire. What the hell is this, Mom? I asked myself. I tried to open it up, the lock was firm. Confused about everything, I decided to bring it downstairs and look for a key that would open this thing. When I picked it up, the weight was heavier than I thought. I also heard something inside shuffle. The mystery only deepened. I placed the box aside and finished clearing out the attic. Almost everything up there ended up in the donate pile, except for the box. In fact, most of my mom's stuff did. I lived in a small apartment and didn't have a ton of room for the furniture. Naturally, there were some pieces I kept, but almost everything would find a new home. That included most of the chickens. A brief moment here to explain. My mom hated chickens. She thought they were gross. Hated the way they looked. Hated the way they sounded. She used to say the only good chicken was one that was deep fried. Of course, this meant that everyone had to buy her chicken-themed things. Little figures, kitchen towels, ceramic sugar bowls, you name it, she had it. She never had the heart to throw any of these gag gifts away, so her house was filled with chicken regalia. Her crown jewel, however, was the crystal chicken I bought her when she finished her nursing program. After my dad died and I moved out, my mom decided to return to school to become a nurse. She had always wanted to do it, and now she didn't have any excuses not to. I was so proud of her. When she did her candle lighting ceremony to celebrate finishing school, I surprised her with a crystal chicken. She laughed and cried, and we hugged so tightly. I can still see her face, her eyes red with tears, but a smile so bright, it could light the darkest night. A memory I often recall to help boost my spirits. I held the chicken and gently rubbed it with my thumb. I swear I could feel her arms around me in that moment. I sat on the ground and just let the tears fall. I laid down in the fetal position and let the sadness wash over me. Once I had cried out every bit of liquid in my body, I stood back up and dusted myself off. I had to finish the job, but I wouldn't be able to do anything unless I got something to eat. Also, and I don't know why, but for some reason, I thought I should stash the box somewhere. I was afraid one of the relatives might take it before I got a chance to see what was inside. I knew they were looky-loos, and they'd search hard for something they wanted. I decided to hide the box back up in the attic. I hid it in a small crawl space area behind the hatch and climbed down. I looked in the mirror and made sure I was still presentable to the outside world, and headed out the door. I was only gone for about 40 minutes or so, but when I got back to my mom's house, I noticed the side door was open. I remembered shutting it, and that fact sent up a red flag in my brain. Was someone inside the house? Maybe one of my mom's friends had come over. Or maybe someone else from the family, I knew a few had, said they'd try and stop by to take some things. Hello, I called out. Anyone home? No response. I walked into the living room, and nothing seemed out of place. In fact, every room looked normal. I walked into Mom's closet and finally noticed something askew. The hatch to the attic was pulled down. Why in the world would someone be up in the attic? I hesitated and then climbed up the ladder. I popped up into the small space and turned on the light. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary up here, either. Not at first. I was about to climb down when I noticed an envelope in the corner of the room. I plucked it off the ground. In a script that definitely wasn't my mother's neat handwriting, someone had scrawled the word open. Not knowing what else to do, I opened it up. Inside was a 3 multiplied by 5 card and what looked like a small patch of dog hair. On the card, someone had typed out, "Do you know the story of Little Red Riding Hood?" That was it. I was confused, and, in fact, I laughed when I read it. What in the world was this? Who had left a cryptic message in an envelope stuffed with dog hair in my dead mother's attic? None of it made sense. I threw the card and hair away and went back downstairs. I hadn't probably closed the door all the way when I shut it, thus, it was open when I got back. As for the card, who knows why it was up there? I chalked it up to some lost artifact my mom had kept around for some meaning lost in time. I must have just missed seeing it when I cleaned upstairs. I didn't give any of it much thought. As I left my mom's closet and walked through her room, I felt a presence watching me. It's hard to explain, but imagine your teacher watching you while you take a test. You know the gaze is there, and you're trying to ignore it, but you can't totally put it out of your head. That was it. It might have been because I was in my mom's still intact room. I had started with the other rooms, and saved this one for last. I needed to build up to it. Dismantling this room would be the final confirmation my mom was gone. I wasn't quite ready for it. So I'd come back another day. I would be in town for a few days to clean up the house before we sold it. I couldn't sleep in my mom's bedroom, so I stayed in the guest room. I had moved most of the furniture out of there, so everything was pretty bare, but I didn't care. I was just going to sleep there. I spent the lion's share of my time on the couch in the living room anyway. That's where I was when I heard the knocking start. I was watching some random, cooking show on cable, when I heard what sounded like a rhythmic knocking coming from the kitchen window. It was like a kid learning to play drums. At first, I ignored it, but soon it got so loud I couldn't. I hauled my tired body to the kitchen and flipped on the lights. Nothing was out of place. Everything seemed normal, but then I started hearing the knocking again, only this time it was coming from outside the house. The way the house was designed, the side door led out into the driveway. My mom's car was still there, the sale was pending, and my beat-up pickup was parked behind it. The new knock sounded like someone was hitting my mom's car. I grabbed a knife from the block and flipped on the light in my phone. I opened the door and stepped outside. There was a slight nip in the air, and I shivered in the light breeze. I wasn't sure what I'd find out here, but I knew I had heard something knocking. I was sad, not crazy. Just then, I heard something in the tree above me rustle. I pointed my camera up and saw something dart away from the beam. Then I heard 2 knocks right next to me. I jumped back and flashed my camera where I heard the sounds. I started laughing. 2 acorns had fallen from the tree and landed on the car. The knocking I had heard was nothing more than a klutzy squirrel. I cackled for longer than I should have, but I needed a good laugh at the moment. The relief that washed over me was cathartic as fuck. I walked back towards the door when I heard something large growl nearby. I froze, and I heard another, higher-pitched growl as I contemplated what to do. Then I heard something big dart off and run through the underbrush and back into the woods. Then a second large thing ran off in the same direction. I ran into the house and slammed the door shut. I locked both locks and dragged a chair under the handle for good measure. I looked up the animal control number and gave them a call. Naturally, they were closed, but I left a message. I went to the guest room and locked that door as well. I wasn't taking any chances. The next morning, I woke up as soon as the sunlight started bleeding through the paper, then curtains. I wouldn't say I had the best night's sleep, but after an hour or so of mindless scrolling on my phone, I finally calmed down enough to doze off. I didn't hear any more growling or knocking the rest of the night. I hesitated to walk back out to the kitchen, but the desire to get coffee cranking through my system as soon as possible broke that hesitation. Again, nothing was out of the ordinary. I started making my coffee when I glanced out the kitchen window and saw another envelope staring back at me. Someone had jammed it in the weatherproofing. In the same handwriting as the note I found in the attic, someone had scrawled the phrase, "Why do you have such big ears?" I quickly went outside, plucked the envelope off the window, and hustled back inside. Once in the friendly confines of my mom's home, I opened the envelope. Inside was another 3 multiplied by 5 card with a single typed message on it. It simply read, "The better to hear you, my darling." The fuck? I muttered. Just then, there was a knock at the door. I was so surprised I dropped the card. Probably the family, I said, assuming the relatives were coming to loot the tomb. I walked over to the door and pulled it open, expecting to see family, but instead being greeted by a guy, dressed like a Mormon missionary. I sighed. I don't believe in God, I said, starting to close the door. I don't either, the pleasant man said. Oh, I said, holding my premature door closure, then what can I do for you? First, I wanted to say how sad I was to hear of your mother's passing. I know that can't be easy to deal with. It's not, but thank you. Did you know her? Yes and no. What does that mean? Well, the man started, I run a small, antique shop a few towns over, and your mom used to come by every once in a while and browse. Okay, I said, unsure where this was headed. Did she steal from you or something? The man laughed. No, no, nothing like that. It was actually a mistake I made about 2 weeks ago. I accidentally sold a piece to your mother that I was supposed to be holding for someone else. What was it? It was a carved little box about this big, he said, holding out his hands. Have you seen anything like that around here? No, I lied. Oh, crackers, he said. Can I come in and take a look? No, sorry, I said with a smile to hopefully back him off. Are you sure? Yeah, pretty sure I don't want a strange man inside my house. Your mother's house, he corrected. Well, if this whole thing wasn't creepy enough, that just clinched it. I tried to shut the door, but he put his foot in the way and blocked the door from closing. I could feel my heart start to race, but I held it together. I did not want to show fear. I bared my teeth some and said, "Move your foot. I'll give you $1,000 for it." I paused. How much was it worth if this guy was willing to pay $1,000 for that box? Could I just cut him out and sell it directly for more money? All of these thoughts ran through my head, but I only spat out the question, "Did you leave a note on my window?" What? He said, confused. Move your foot, please. 2,000, he said. I don't have the box, I said as I stomped on the top of his foot with my heel. He yelped and pulled his foot back as I slammed and locked the door. I watched him through the little peephole. He swore under his breath, so definitely not Mormon, sighed, and slammed the screen door. I watched him walk away, but didn't see any vehicle. Not even a bike. By the time I moved to the window to take a look, he was gone entirely. I was a little shaken but not too concerned. Now I wondered what the hell was in that box. I needed to find the key to unlock it, meaning I needed to clean my mom's room. The time had come. I walked to her room and put my hand on the door handle. I side-twisted the handle and pushed the door open wide. It creaked as it opened, and I could see all the dust in the air from the rays of light streaming through the blinds. I crossed the threshold and felt a weight on my shoulders. This wasn't going to be fun. I first checked my mom's key ring for anything that might look like it'd work. There was nothing. I paced around the room and made a mental tally of all the places to place a key to a hidden box in the attic. The first stop was the dresser. I went through all the drawers and was shocked at some of the more racy garments my mom apparently had, but I didn't find any keys. After that, I went to the bedside tables and went over every inch of them. Didn't see anything. Same for every other conceivable place in her room. I spent hours taking that room apart in search of the key and didn't find any trace of it. I even took a break for lunch and came back with fresh eyes. Still nothing. I could feel my frustrations mounting. A thought scratched the surface of my brain and started to take root. She didn't have a key. If that was the case, I should have just sold that weirdo the box and be done with it. But my curiosity had been piqued. Why did he want this box so badly? What was inside? Why had my mom hidden it? The more I thought about it, the more my head filled with questions with no answers. I was so frustrated. Out of anger, I kicked her bedside table. A second later, I heard something metallic drop to the floor. I moved the end table and saw a key laying on the ground. It had been taped to the underside of the end table. It looked like the perfect fit for the lock. I couldn't believe it. I bent down, picked it up, and gave it a once-over. So there you are, I said. I went to my mom's closet and pulled down the stairs to the attic. I climbed up, clutching the key so tight in my palm it was leaving indentations. But I didn't want to drop an old brass-colored key onto the brown carpet and start my search all over again. Once I got to the attic, I walked over to the box and squatted to pull it out. However, something was pulling me away from the box and towards the half-moon ventilation window. It was just a feeling I got in the base of my skull that told me to peek out at the street below. I'm glad I did. My mom's house sits on a street that butts up against a small patch of woods. It's not in the country, but it's not like a typical suburb either. It's the bleeding edge of the suburbs, really. The line where developers stopped gobbling up the trees to make identical little boxes. Houses were still spaced out with large yards, and dirt roads reigned supreme. You were technically in a neighborhood, but not like the tightly packed sardine can place I now lived. As my eyes scanned the tree line, something out of place caught my vision. The guy who tried to buy the box was standing back in the greenery. He was holding a pair of binoculars and staring out at my house. Instinctively, I leaned back a bit from the window, hoping he wouldn't spot me. He seemed to be talking to some other unseen person. I looked around but couldn't see any other person near him. Who was this guy? Why did he want this box so badly? As I pondered, I watched as he took several steps back into the tree line, and I lost sight of him for good. Then I heard glass break downstairs. The person he was talking to had just broken a window in my house. I assumed they would be entering shortly. I cursed myself for not having a weapon, especially after the earlier encounter. I knew I didn't want them to know I was up here. I quickly but quietly padded over to the open attic hatch and pulled it closed. I was trapped, but I was out of sight. I only hoped they wouldn't come looking for me. After an agonizing few seconds, I heard the kitchen window open and the screen get kicked in. The person climbed in, rather clumsily from the sounds of it, walked over to the side door and opened it up. He was letting in someone else to help him. I assumed it was the man from earlier, but I wasn't sure if it was just him. What if there were more? What if they were armed? What if they wouldn't take no for an answer? I decided I needed to hide the box somewhere up here where they may not find it. My original spot was fine, but you could see it if you looked. I needed something better. Glancing up, I saw some pink insulation that had pulled away from the wood beams. I stuffed the box in there and pulled the insulation back over it to hide it. It wasn't elegant, but it was the best I could do at the moment. In the house below me, I could hear at least two people talking, though I had a hard time making out anything concrete. I wanted to press my ear to the floor to see if I could catch snippets, but I was afraid I'd give away my position. If they came up here, there were only two ways out: fight them and scramble down the stairs, or punch out the half-moon window and jump. Neither sounded feasible. They were slowly making their way through the house. From where I was standing, their conversation sounded like grunting. I glanced over and found a small length of pipe, no larger than my forearm, and grabbed it. It wouldn't be much, but it'd be something. My heart was pounding like a tom-tom when I heard the two of them enter my mom's room. They were so close, I could make out their conversations now. I leaned in close, carefully balancing myself to avoid making any noise. What happened in here? A gruff, unknown voice asked. Someone gave this room a good toss, said the pseudo-Mormon that had been at my door. Do any of the other clans know about this? Asked the gruff voice. Not that I'm aware of, sir, said the non-Mormon. Fucking hell, the gruff voice said, you're supposed to do a thorough vetting process before anyone can join. How did you fuck this up? I'm sorry. She was my nurse and she seemed like a good fit for. His voice trailed off. Did you hear that? The gruff voice whispered. Did it come from? The non-Mormon started, but the gruff voice cut him off. Yes. Follow me, he said as quietly as possible. I pushed myself back up and watched the attic hatch like a hawk. I cocked the piece of pipe back and waited for the hatch to open. I was going to brain the first person that came up those stairs. But the hatch never opened. Instead, the two men moved out of my mom's room and back into the living room. Then one of them yelled, "What are you doing here?" Someone threw something, and then there was a struggle. I didn't know who was down there, but the fight got more intense the longer it went on. I heard crashing and smashing and screaming and growling. Whatever was going on downstairs was brutal. Then the howling started. Whatever was down there started howling so loud that I dropped the pipe and covered my ears. I was afraid it was going to rupture my eardrums. I didn't care that the pipe dropping could give my hiding spot away. The noise cut through me like a saw. Over the fading howl, I heard people rush towards any exit from the house. There was yelling and screaming and threats, but then there was silence. I waited about 30 minutes in a crouch, my knees were screaming in pain, before I decided to go down and check what had happened. I was greeted with a monumental mess. Furniture was flipped and torn open. Glass was shattered. The back door was left open. There were streaks of blood on the floor and walls. Whatever happened here wasn't pretty. There was something odd, though, about the mess. In the middle of the chaos sat the little crystal chicken. It looked perfectly okay, no cracks or broken pieces. What was odd was I had left it on the bookcase in the other room, yesterday, and not in the middle of the kitchen floor. The bookcase hadn't been tipped over, so someone had to pick the chicken off the shelf and place it on the ground. Who the hell would do that? I decided I needed to call the cops. I had little hope that they would solve the case, but I thought I might need a record of the break-in. 30 minutes later, a squad car rolled up. 2 cops got out and greeted me. They were nice enough, listened to what I had to say, and wrote some of it down. They asked if anything was stolen, and I said I wasn't sure but didn't think so. About 10 minutes later, one of the cops headed back to the cruiser, but one hung back. He was handsome, with his youthful face and big bright eyes. He shot me a warm smile, and, for a moment, I forgot my general negative feelings toward the police. We'll look into this, but, to be honest, there isn't a lot here to go on, he said. Can't you test the blood? They won't, especially if nothing was taken. Great, I said. I know it's been hard for you in the last couple of days. What? I said, startled. I'm sorry for your loss, he said softly. I was the one that got the call about your mom. Oh, I said, thank you. He took a step closer to me. Did you know that she was alive when we found her? What? Oh yeah. It was supposed to be a clean hit, but she moved last minute, and the car didn't get her as solidly as I would have liked. The fuck? I balled up my fist and was ready to punch. I told her that she couldn't hide from us. You can't either, he said with a grin. Get the fuck away from me, I whispered, my legs trembling. We'll be back when it's dark, he said. You won't see us, but we'll see you, darling. It's why we have such big eyes. As he said it, his pupils flashed from brown to yellow. Roddy, his partner, yelled, we got a robbery in progress nearby. Let's hop to it. You can lock the doors, but it won't matter, he whispered. Then, like a robot flipping a switch, any sinister vibes drained from his body, and he was back to the regular guy he was minutes earlier. Have a good night, ma'am. I turned and ran back into the house. I decided that I needed to go. I grabbed my car keys and ran out to my car. I put my key in the ignition and turned, but nothing happened. I tried again and again, but the engine was dead. I popped open the hood and saw that someone had sliced a bunch of wires inside. My mom's car was the same way. I was trapped. I ran back inside and, despite the cops' warnings, I locked the doors. I grabbed knives and hid them around the house in case I needed one. I kept the butcher knife on me. Thought about running, but if they were watching me, they'd see me leave, and I assumed they'd catch me. They seemed to have some kind of magic or something. It sounded crazy, but I didn't know what else to call it. Finally, I went back up into the attic and grabbed that box. It was time to see what the hell was inside. I pulled up the stairs and locked myself up there with my knife. I retrieved the box from the insulation and laid it in front of me. Here goes nothing, I said as I slid the key in and turned. A tinny music box song started playing as I pulled open the lid. I didn't recognize the tune, but it played the entire time the box lid was open. Inside, the box was stuffed with papers. Some were brand new, and others were yellowed with age, but each one looked alike. It was just a list of names, like a roster. The hell. The dates on the pages were varied. One from 2022, 1983, 1947, 1892, 1849, 1781. What was stranger still was that some of the names were on every roster. Some of these names I knew, some everyone in the world knew. If this information got out, the entire world would change. Here I was, the daughter of a late-in-life nurse, holding evidence that proved a myth real. Astounding. My brain was having a hard time comprehending all of this information. Were these werewolves? Was that possible? More to the point, how had my mom gotten caught up in all this? She really did live a life I had no idea about. Someone started screaming outside my house. I ran over to the half-moon window and peered out. I saw the non-Mormon standing out there. He pointed at the window, and I knew I was fucked. He was aware of where I was. I know you're in there, and I know what you have. You may not know what you're holding, but trust me when I say that I will do anything to get it back, the man yelled. Give it to me, and I leave, and you never see or hear from us again. I tightened the grip around my knife. My best guess was my mom had someone get a hold of this, realized what it was, and was planning on exposing it. They didn't like that, and they killed her. My God, they killed her? Now they wanted the box, but even if I gave it to them, they'd have to clean up the mess. They'd have to kill me, too. If you don't, well, then you'll get to discover what I have these big teeth for, he said with a laugh. But I'm already full, so be a good sport and just hand over the box. Not a fucking chance, I thought. I was going to go down with the ship. I didn't have any way out of this mess. I decided that I wouldn't go down without a fight. I'd honor my mom by fighting her fight for her. She didn't raise a sissy. Werewolf or not, I was content to fuck one of them up or die trying. Before I could go downstairs, though, I heard a howl. Then another. And another. I walked back to the window and saw 3 wolves circling the non-Mormon. He looked frightened, these were not his friends. You're going against the way. He screamed. Your clan will be all of our downfall. Then they set on him. I backed away from the window and shut my eyes. The sound of 3 wolves tearing into a man is the most disturbing thing I've ever heard. His screams have nested in my brain and will never leave. I hope never to hear the wet slap of meat being slammed into the ground again. Minutes later, I heard a howl. I opened my eyes and stood back up. I peeked out the window and saw the 3 wolves in the middle of the street, howling together. Whatever was left of the man was gone, save for a message written in his blood. It read, "You're safe." For some reason, I believed it. These guys had killed the man threatening me. They wouldn't have done it if they wanted to hurt me too. I decided to head downstairs. I clutched onto the knife and the box with my life as I went down the ladder and through the mess in the house. I walked to the front door and opened it. I could feel the cool night air, blowing my hair back. I looked out to the street, and where I had previously seen 3 wolves, a lone man stood under the street light. He waved to me. I walked to him. He was so big and bulky. Not fat but fit and as tall as the day is long. Easily over 6'4". His brown skin seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the street light. But his face was warm and inviting. As I approached, he gave me a pleasant smile. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said. I shut my eyes, I said. "Probably for the best." He eyed the knife in my hand. "I'm not here to hurt you. None of us are. You'll forgive me if I keep holding it. Not to be rude or anything." He nodded. "I understand. Are you?" "Yes," he said before I finished asking. "Holy shit," I said in a whisper. "We've been around for a long time," he said. He pointed at the box in my arms and said, "But I imagine you know that already, seeing as you opened the box." "How did you know I opened it?" "We heard the song. We all did. That's how we knew we were needed. Is it like, I dunno, a bat signal or something?" He let out a deep bass-filled laugh. "Something like that, yes. Was my mom." "We failed your mother," he said in a regretful tone. "For that, I can only apologize. I'm sorry you'll never get to see her in her natural form again." I started crying. The finality of everything just struck. I felt dumb for crying in front of this hulking stranger, but I couldn't stop myself. Instead, he leaned over and hugged me. I dropped the knife and hugged him back. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe. After collecting myself, I looked down at the box and into his eyes. "Does this belong to you?" "No," he said, "it belongs to all of us. We're just tasked with keeping it safe." "Then, you better keep it," I said, handing it over. "Thank you," he said, bowing towards me. "Am I safe?" "There were others." "They have been taken care of," he said, nodding at the blood on the ground. "Message received. Will more come?" "Perhaps," he said, "but there will always be someone watching over you. Believe me." I nodded, and he turned and walked back into the woods. After a minute, he faded into the darkness altogether, and I stood alone in the middle of the street. A weight was lifted from my shoulders. I felt calm, eerily so. A week passed, and I managed to clean up and ship out everything in my mom's house. I had one last thing I wanted to do before I left all of this madness behind and returned to my wonderfully boring and normal life. I had to see her grave. My mother's final resting spot is one worthy of her beauty and grace. It sits on a small hill shaded by a blooming magnolia tree that gently shakes in the constant pleasant breezes. The view of the sunsets are amazing. If she were still around, I think she'd agree it was perfect. I came to say my final goodbyes and left her a little gift. On her headstone, I placed the crystal chicken. I couldn't think of a better place for it. It was hers, anyway. I kissed my fingers and put them on the headstone. I whispered my goodbyes and then walked towards my waiting car. When I turned around to get one last look, I saw what I thought was, at first, a dog moved to the headstone. But on closer inspection, it was clearly a wolf. Suddenly, the big stranger's words came back to me. I wouldn't see her in her natural form. But someone was always watching over me. I locked eyes with the wolf, and she sat on her haunches and lowered her head. I knew it was her. Though my brain was screaming for logic, my heart shushed it to sleep. Then, as gently as a mother cradling a baby, she took hold of the crystal chicken in her mouth and darted off into the woods. Bye, Mom, I said and let the tears fall. Story 2. My wife Lynn and I have been together for 6 years and married for 11 months. Our entire history together has been very normal and never once have I noticed any weird behaviors or red flags. I can't stress enough how out of character this whole thing is for her. Lynn is very kind, intelligent, and thoughtful. She's always been the no-nonsense type of person. Being childish or trying to scare me is not something she'd normally do. She doesn't even like watching horror movies. When we first started dating, she agreed to watch The Shining with me because she knew how much I loved horror. She was so scared that she didn't even make it through half of the movie before we had to turn it off. She isn't into anything creepy and has never been into pranks. It's just not her cup of tea. And that's fine. But that's what was so strange about this. It's just so unlike her. I should also add that she never had any mental health issues, and as far as I'm aware, it doesn't run in her family. I know some people are able to hide their mental health problems, but in the 6 years we've been together, I think I'd have seen some sort of sign. 2 months ago, I was in the kitchen, making myself some coffee before work. I was running a bit late that morning and knew I wouldn't be able to make it to Dunkin' Donuts for my usual morning fix. I took a sip of my coffee as I hurried down the hall towards the front door, when I happened to notice Lynn peeking at me from around the corner ahead of me. I could only see her eyes and a strand of her long dark hair hanging against the wall. The rest of her body was concealed behind the corner. I nearly spilled my coffee when I saw her. I did burn the shit out of my lips. Geez, Lynn, I said, wiping a few drops of coffee from my pants. You scared the shit out of me. She immediately popped out of view like a little kid that had been caught. I heard her scurry off towards the living room, and by the time I got to the front door, she was out of sight. It was really weird, and just totally out of character for her, like I said, but I also found it kind of funny that she was being more playful, and a little less serious. I shouted that I loved her, and called her a weirdo. As I shut the door behind me, I heard her laughing. Her behavior was a bit odd, but it certainly wasn't something to call a priest over. I forgot about it by lunch, and by the time I got home she was her normal self. I didn't bring it up and neither did she, and life went on. The next incident happened 3 days later. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up to get a drink. I was standing at the kitchen island, jug of OJ in hand, when I felt a strong feeling that I was being watched. For whatever reason, I looked down at the floor and saw my wife's smiling face staring back. She was peeking at me from the other side of the island, staring up at me with wide unblinking eyes and grinning. Grinning like the Cheshire Cat. I screamed, I'll admit it. Not out of irritation, but fear. For some reason at that moment I was scared. At the sound of my scream, Lynn scuttled backwards out of my view, her hands and feet smacking the tile floor as she hurried out of the kitchen on all fours. I didn't run after her, or even yell after her. I just stood there frozen in shock, wondering what fuck had possessed her to do that. It took me a little longer than I'd like to admit to go back upstairs, but I eventually did. When I got to our bedroom, Lynn was lying on her side, asleep. Or at least pretending to be. I stood there for a while, watching her breathing to be sure she really was asleep. I had the feeling she might jump out at me the moment I got into bed. But she didn't. I climbed into bed and she didn't even move. Her breathing was soft and deep, and I was starting to wonder if I'd dreamt the whole thing. The next morning I waited for her to come down for coffee, and after handing her a mug and kissing her cheek I decided to ask her about it. What was that about last night? I asked, keeping my tone light so I didn't offend or embarrass her. She frowned over her cup of coffee, shaking her head like she had no clue what I was referring to. You were peeking at me again. From over there, I said, pointing to the spot on the floor by the kitchen island. She followed my gaze, and when she looked back at me she burst out laughing. She laughed so hard that I couldn't help but join her. You creep me the fuck out sometimes, you know that? I said. She giggled and set her cup on the counter and wrapped her arms around my neck. You creep me out all the time. So I guess we're even. She teased. We said our goodbyes and left for work. As I drove, I kept thinking about how creepy it had been seeing her grinning at me from behind the island like that. The sounds her hands made on the floor as she crawled away. I told myself she was just trying to be silly. Just trying to join me in my love of all things horror. It's not like I was afraid of her. But it still didn't sit right with me. I started seeing her peeking at me more and more. Sometimes she'd be peeking out from behind the couch or living room curtains. Once she even managed to get inside her grandmother's old trunk that sits at the foot of our bed. I might not have even known she was there at all had the trunk's old hinges not given her away. She'd had the lid propped up just enough so that only half of her face peeked through. She'd been grinning like an excited toddler. It was unnerving. I didn't even know what to say to her. All I could do was stare. When I finally found my voice, I asked her why on earth was she doing this. She didn't answer, but she had slowly closed the lid, shutting herself inside the trunk. I just walked away, feeling disturbed. I didn't understand why she was doing it, but it clearly made her happy. I just hoped she would tire of the game quickly. Lynn didn't peek at me for the next 2 weeks. I started to think she was done with her weird prank and I was relieved. We were watching a show on Netflix one night and I jokingly said that I hadn't seen her peeking at me lately, and that she must have given up on her spy game. She looked up at me with a small smile and said, "Maybe I've just gotten better at it." I didn't say anything, but I wondered whether or not she was joking. For the next few days I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Was she still peeking at me when I wasn't looking and I just hadn't noticed? And if so, what the hell was she getting out of this? I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking whether she was watching from around the corner or behind a door. I was jumpy whenever I was home and she wasn't in full view of me. I felt stupid and a little crazy. But after a few weeks without another incident, I began to relax. I stopped checking behind furniture and walls and told myself it was just a bad memory. Then a few days ago things got so much worse. Lynn left to go to a friend's, and I lounged on the couch and played a couple games on my laptop. Around 9 p.m. I hopped in the shower and as I was washing the soap from my hair, I felt that awful feeling that I was being watched. I slowly opened my eyes and almost had a fucking heart attack. Lynn was peeking from behind the shower curtain, her entire head stretched into the shower, leaving just her body outside. Her long dark hair hung against the curtain, the ends dripping with water. Her mouth hung open in a terrible grin, eyes wide and red, as if she hadn't blinked in a while. I screamed and jumped back against the wall. She didn't move nor did her smile waver. Her makeup ran down her cheeks in 2 black streaks. She looked giddy and completely deranged. I was fucking terrified. We stood like that for a few moments, neither of us saying a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, she slowly pulled her head back out of the shower, and I watched her blurry figure through the curtain as she moved backwards towards the bathroom door. A second later the bathroom door slammed shut, hard enough to rattle the mirror. I screamed again, and jumped out of the shower to lock the door. I stayed inside the bathroom for over an hour. Maybe I overreacted to some of you. But joke or not, I wasn't going to put up with the crazy shit anymore. That's what I kept telling myself as I paced in my bathroom, stopping to listen at the door every few minutes. Suddenly I heard a muffled sound, and I pressed my ear against the bathroom door, straining to listen. I couldn't hear anything, but I envisioned Lynn standing on the other side of the door, giggling at her joke. I felt a surge of anger. I was beyond pissed at being made to feel scared in my own house, and made to hide in the bathroom for an hour. All for what? Some joke. If it was a joke, it was an awful one. What the fuck, Lynn? I snapped. This shit is getting really fucking annoying. I waited for her to apologize, or to call me a jerk. But instead I heard a faint moan, so quiet I wondered if I heard it at all, and then complete silence. Lynn. I called out, not able to even hide the shakiness in my voice. I got no response. Just my own heavy breathing. I swear to God, just fucking stop it. I yelled, pounding my fist on the door. I waited for her to cuss me out, something I would expect from me talking to her like that. I never screamed at her before. But there was nothing. Just the occasional drip from the shower head. I won't deny that I was scared. Too afraid to open the damn door and face my own wife. I waited another 30 minutes or so, which feels like a fucking lifetime when you're scared. Finally I decided I wasn't going to spend the night hiding in my bathroom, so I got down on my knees and peered under the door. I almost expected to see her face peeking back at me, but thankfully I didn't. I could see straight down the hallway to the top of the stairs, but no Lynn. I didn't know if I should be happy about that or not. I looked for a few minutes, waiting to see her head pop up over the top step, but it never came. I stood up, my hand hovering over the door and mentally prepared myself to open it. I slowly turned the lock with shaky fingers, and was about to yank it open, when I heard a sound that still makes me feel nauseous when I think about it. A moan, louder than before, but this time I was able to tell just where it was coming from. I turned my head to the closet door, as if in slow motion, and locked eyes with my wife who was peeking out at me from the slight gap. Her eyes were still wide, as ever, and her mouth was hanging open in the most grotesque gaping smile I'd ever seen. I didn't even scream. I was too scared for even that. Her hands were clasped to her chest, body trembling with sheer delight, as if she could barely contain her excitement. A short, raspy moan bubbled up from her throat, deep and raw, sending a shiver through my entire body. Somehow I found the ability to pull the bathroom door open and ran as fast as I could all the way down the steps, snagging my keys and phone from the table in the living room before running outside to my car. I could hear her shrill laughter behind me, but I didn't hear her getting closer. I didn't bother shutting the front door. I drove away from the house faster than I legally should have, shivering the entire time, either from fear or the cold. Maybe a little of both. I hadn't grabbed a coat or even a pair of shoes. I was still in my boxers and my hair was still damp. I drove straight to my brother Chris's house about 40 minutes away, ignoring any and every call and text I got. I didn't check my phone until I was safely parked in my brother's driveway. Lynn had called 4 times and sent a flurry of texts, all wondering where I'd gone, and why I left like that. I threw my phone at the dash in a rage, furious at her nonchalant attitude. My brother and his wife were surprised to see me, especially dressed in just a pair of boxers, but told me to stay as long as I needed. Chris lent me some clothes and asked me what happened. I told him Lynn and I had a fight, but didn't get into the details. I didn't want him to think I was overreacting, leaving my wife over a prank, even if it was a strange one. I mean, hadn't I encouraged her for years to lighten up instead of being so serious all the time? I had wanted her to relax and loosen up, but this was definitely not what I'd had in mind. I tried to sleep on their sofa, but my brain wouldn't let me sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I saw Lynn's face staring at me from inside the closet. Knowing she'd been in there with me the entire time made my skin crawl. She'd never left the fucking bathroom at all. Instead she slipped inside the closet and slammed the bathroom door shut to fool me. The mere thought of going back home gave me anxiety. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Chris ended up giving me a sleeping pill so I was able to get a little rest. My sleep was filled with terrible dreams. All of Lynn's smiling face. I woke up just as the sun started to rise. My sore body ached from the sofa, and I felt drained. I knew I'd have to call Lynn at some point, but I didn't know what to say to her. I wouldn't be going home unless she gave me her word she'd never do any more creepy shit. I just wanted my wife back. Her normal serious self never looked so good to me. I was contemplating calling her and telling her that, when that familiar feeling came over me. I was being watched. I was staring at the ceiling, my heart in my throat. I didn't want to look away, but the longer I ignored the feeling the worse it got. My eyes drifted away from the ceiling almost on their own. Her face was pressed up against the window beside the couch, staring down at me with that same gaping smile. Drool dribbled down her lips, leaving 2 long streaks down the glass. I didn't know how long she'd been there, but something told me she'd been there quite a while, possibly all night. I didn't bother screaming, though I was afraid anger trumped any fear I felt at that moment. I jumped up from the couch and pounded my palm against the glass. Lynn, are you crazy? What the hell is wrong with you? Just go home, I shouted. Now. She didn't move, and her ghastly expression never changed. If anything, her smile only grew, as if she had never been more elated. I could hear Chris and his wife moving around upstairs. As if Lynn could hear them from her place outside, her head twitched slightly in their direction, and she began to close her mouth slowly. Chris called my name from upstairs, obviously concerned. I turned to see him and his wife Rebecca hurrying down the steps. When I turned back to the window, Lynn was gone. The only sign she'd been there at all was the 2 streaks of drool, still dripping down the glass. I tried explaining to Chris and Rebecca about waking up to see Lynn watching me through their window. They were skeptical, who wouldn't be? Chris and I went outside to the spot in front of the window, but there were no footprints in the dirt, just a slight indent. Animal probably, Chris guessed, and I didn't argue. He and Rebecca assumed I dreamt the entire episode, but they didn't understand, and I was too tired to explain it to them. I called out of work that day and turned my cell off. I didn't want to face Lynn. Just talking to her was too much for me at that point. I really started to believe something was irreversibly wrong with her. That no matter what promises she made, we'd never be the same again. The thought saddened me to my core. I cried most of the morning. By noon I figured I was ready to confront her. Give her one last chance to explain herself. I could at least give her that after 6 years, I told myself. I turned my phone on and saw the dozens of texts she'd sent, all from a seemingly concerned wife. Can we talk? I love you. Please call me. I'm really worried. Can you answer? Just come home. And more of the same. All texts telling me she loved me and she wanted me home. How worried she was. Not a damn one addressing the crazy shit she pulled. Like she hadn't been acting like a character from a Stephen King book. Even her texts were different. She normally texted novels just to tell me to pick up a loaf of bread. You'd think she'd have more to say to me after her bizarre shenanigans. I know it probably seems childish to some of you, who are miles away from this situation. But if you saw the way Lynn had looked at me, how she scampered away on all fours like some wild animal, grinning at me from inside the closet like a lunatic. Then I think you'd find my reaction was warranted. I ended up staying with Chris and Rebecca for another night. I didn't wake up yesterday until afternoon, and thankfully I didn't see Lynn's face watching me through the window. I don't want to pry, because it's not my place. But is this fight something that can be mended? Rebecca asked. She'd made us both a sandwich for lunch, and I knew she wanted to breach the subject without seeming to be nosy. I don't know. She's like a different person, I said, choosing my words carefully. I still wasn't ready for her or Chris to know the full extent of the batshit craziness I had been dealing with. People change, Ben. But she's still the same woman you married. Maybe you both just need to talk through your issues. Whatever's going on, I'm sure it can be fixed. She said, ever the peacemaker. I think it's beyond that now. I don't think talking would help. I just don't trust her. I said. The words stung in my heart. I missed and loved my wife. But how could I live with someone like that? Living in constant fear didn't sound too appealing. Lynn loves you. She has to be absolutely crushed. She said. I don't know about that. I said. Well, she certainly seemed like it to me. I've never seen her so upset. Very much unlike the Lynn I know. Rebecca said, shaking her head sadly. It took a full minute for her words to really sink in, and when they did, I felt dread worming its way through my skin. Wait. What do you mean? You saw her. You saw Lynn? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Rebecca nodded casually as if that fact wasn't nightmare fuel. Maybe for her it wasn't. She stopped by this morning just after Chris left for work. She said, cleaning the plates from the table. I didn't see her car though. Maybe she took an Uber or something. Heck. What did she say? Did she come inside? I asked, sweat starting to break out on my forehead. I began looking around, examining corners as though a predator lurked behind them. No, she just asked if you were awake yet and I said that you weren't. I asked if she wanted me to wake you, but she said no, just said to let you sleep. She said as she washed the dishes. That's all. She didn't say anything else. I asked. No, she looked awful though. Like she hadn't slept in days. I think you should call her. I got up from the table and thanked Rebecca for lunch. I felt a little bit better at the knowledge that, at least she hadn't come inside. Still, I needed to double-check that the doors were locked. I sat for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to go home, but I felt that I owed it to Lynn to help her if I could. Hadn't I sworn an oath to love and honor her through sickness and in health? Clearly she was very sick. If she was sick, which I truly believed she was, I had to try and get her the help she needed. But I didn't even know where to start. I didn't want to call the police, and besides, what the hell was I going to tell them? That my wife was peeking at me. That she was being creepy. As bizarre as she'd been, she still hadn't committed any crime. Not yet anyway. The police would have probably said that I was overreacting. But this wasn't some prank. It felt wrong. Dangerous even. Like something sinister lurked beneath her smile. I knew as her husband I was well within my rights to have her committed, but what if she simply acted normal in their presence? She'd obviously been able to fool Rebecca into thinking she was just a concerned wife. As long as the doctors didn't find her a danger to herself or others, they'd have no choice but to release her after 72 hours. I felt lost and overwhelmed. So I did what any husband in my position would do. I called her mother. I didn't want to, believe me. Her mother, Marianne, and I were never on the best of terms. We'd never fought or anything like that. She just wasn't a very warm person and wasn't really easy to get along with. She hardly ever smiled, and when she did, only her lips would move into a thin-lipped smile, leaving her eyes as blank as before. She gave off this aura that felt like she was permanently on the offensive. I'd only met her twice and both times were for such short visits. I got the impression she didn't approve of me for her daughter. Lynn always ushered us out quickly, as she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable, which I was grateful for. Being in her mother's company felt almost unbearable. Like walking on glass. I was glad when we moved 3 states away so we didn't have to see her often. I was happy to avoid the woman, but I needed her help. I really didn't want to talk to her at all, but I had to talk to someone, and someone who knew Lynn better than I did. So I grit my teeth and did what I had to. Yes, she answered, already sounding irritated. Marianne, it's me, Ben. Do you have a minute to talk? I asked. I could hear her cluck her tongue in irritation. I'm in the middle of writing some checks, but if you insist, I suppose I can spare a moment. What is it that you want to discuss, Benjamin? She said, coolly. It's about Lynn. She's been acting strangely, and I was wondering if you had any idea whether there was something minus. I was quickly interrupted. It's a bit difficult to follow your rambling, Benjamin. What is that you want from me? She asked. I could almost see her standing there in her thin sweater and slacks, tapping her fingernails impatiently on the table. I wanted to know if you'd ever noticed any odd behavior. Or possibly any mental health issues. I asked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause that I couldn't tell was because she was just thinking, or something else. Finally, after a few seconds, she spoke. I'm not sure if this is one of your jokes, Benjamin, but if so, I don't find the humor in it. Now I do have business to attend to, as I've said, so if you don't mind, minus, she said, but I cut her off before she could get rid of me. Marianne, it's not a joke. I'm sincerely concerned about Lynn's mental health. Her behavior has been very erratic lately. I'm very worried about her, and I figured as her mother, you would be as well. I said, my frustration evident in my voice. If you're truly concerned, then I suggest you get the health professionals involved. I don't know what you expect of me. She snapped. I could tell she was seconds away from hanging up, and for some reason I was desperate not to let her. I had the feeling that she knew a lot more than she was letting on. Please. If not for me, do it for Lynn. I tried. I heard a faint shaky intake of breath, as if she were trying to hold her steely persona together but failing. Marianne. What's WR minus, I started. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Benjamin, I don't know what to tell you. My only advice would be to seek professional help. Do not call here again. Goodbye. I tried to call out to her, but she'd hung up. I tried to wrap my head around the call and her refusal to help me. Even if she didn't like me, why wouldn't she want to help her own daughter? I couldn't understand that. I tried to replay the conversation, desperate to find something I missed. After a while I almost gave up, until I remembered her last words to me. Seek professional help. She'd said those words with a bit of urgency. I could have just been grasping at straws, but no, I was sure her voice had changed ever so slightly when she'd said that. As if they were very important. What had she meant? I assumed she'd been referring to medical professionals, but maybe she was referring to someone else. Someone that she didn't, for some reason, feel comfortable saying directly. Or maybe I was just desperate. I waited for Chris to get home, and after a very long and exhausting conversation with him and Rebecca, I convinced them that Lynn truly needed psychiatric help. I didn't tell them everything. I wasn't prepared to go into it yet, but I told them about our last encounter. How she'd hidden in the bathroom, peeking at me from the closet. They were obviously shocked, but thankfully they believed me. They too just wanted to help her. Still, they didn't think it was all that serious. Weird, maybe, but not dangerous. They just kept saying that Lynn had to be playing some kind of weird joke. Maybe for YouTube. Rebecca offered, if only half-heartedly. Chris didn't think we should involve the police just yet. He offered instead to go with me, and I readily accepted. He reasoned that calmly talking to her, trying to coax her into going willingly was the best recourse. I agreed to do it his way. At least I wouldn't be going into that house alone. We drove over this morning, just after breakfast. There was no way I was going at night. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach began doing somersaults. Her car wasn't there, but I still didn't let my guard down. The front door was ajar, and for a split second I thought we'd see her eyes staring through the gap. I was shaking and starting to sweat. Chris, however, was fine. He waited for me to open the door, his hands in his pockets like he was going on a fucking stroll through the park. I envied his ignorance. I pushed the door open and was immediately hit with the stench of rot. Chris smelled it too, and he walked in the house behind me with his nose scrunched up. "What do you guys use to clean the floors around here, shit?" Chris mumbled. "Shut up," I said, my eyes darting around for any signs of Lynn. The house was deadly quiet and dark despite being 10 in the morning. All the curtains were closed up tight, refusing to allow any sunlight inside. If I hadn't left it just 2 days prior, I'd have thought the house to be abandoned. We moved through each room, carefully checking any place that she might hide, occasionally calling her name. "Why the fuck are you looking under the couch?" Chris asked eventually. "Aren't we looking for your wife?" He was looking at me like I was a moron. "Let's just go upstairs," I whispered. He shook his head but followed me up the stairs to check the bathroom and spare bedroom. On the way up, my shoes crunched over pieces of glass that looked to be littered over a few of the steps. I noticed that one of Lynn and my wedding portraits that hung on the wall along the staircase had been smashed. The frame hung crookedly, all the glass removed. I stared at the picture, a lump forming in my throat. We had taken the photo just after leaving the church, after saying our vows. She looked so beautiful in her white gown. I looked at Lynn's beautiful face. I never dreamed her face would ever be a source of terror for me. We climbed the rest of the steps and checked the spare bedroom, but it looked completely untouched. I was hesitant to go into the bathroom, my fear from that night coming back to me, all at once. Chris noticed, and offered to go in by himself, but I couldn't let him do that. So we walked in together, checking the closet and the shower. The bathroom looked as if it hadn't been touched since the night I left. "I don't think she's here, Ben. Why don't you pack some clothes and we'll try coming back tomorrow or something?" Chris said. I nodded and went into our bedroom and shoved some clothes into a duffel bag. When I checked inside our closet, I came across the source of the smell and gagged. Chris took one look and lost all color in his face. He had to go stand by the stairs to get away from the sight and smell. I gazed down in shock at what lay inside my bedroom closet. Soaking into the rug were at least a dozen eyeballs, all carefully laid out in pairs. Some were as large as a quarter, while others were as tiny as a marble. I stared down at the eye she'd collected from small animals, and I wondered how she'd gotten them, and shuddered at the thought. Man, I thought I had it bad with Becca's shoe addiction. But fuck me. "Your wife's in here collecting eyeballs," Chris said, gagging. "Ben, I think we should go," he called from the hall. "I'm getting nauseous." "All right." I grabbed my duffel and shut the closet door on my new nightmare. I stepped out into the hall and took a deep breath of air. I could taste the rot on my tongue and I couldn't help but gag. Who the fuck lines up eyeballs in their closet like that? Chris mumbled. "I tried to tell you she needed help," I said. "She doesn't need help, Ben. She needs a fucking exorcist," he said. "You coming or what?" I can't stand the smell any minus. His words died in his throat, and his eyes grew wide with fear. I didn't ask him why. I could feel it. Someone was watching me and I didn't think it was the eyes in the closet. I turned around, my eyes slowly scanning the bedroom. "Christ," I whispered, as I finally saw what we'd missed. Under the bed, curled on her side, watching us with the excitement of a kid on Christmas morning, was my wife. She held her hands together just under her chin, and they were shaking eagerly. Now that she knew she'd been found, I could hear the quiet noises she was making. A sort of hiccuping sound in her throat, as if the excitement was just too much for her. It was unnerving to say the least. Wide eyes, and that same huge smile. Everything in me told me to run, but I forced it away. This was my wife. No matter how twisted, she was still the woman I married. I had to help her. "Lynn," I said softly. She didn't respond, but her head bobbed back and forth in 2 quick little movements as if she were nodding. "Baby. I just want to help, okay? Can you let me do that?" I asked. I had taken a single step forward, approaching her like some kind of dangerous animal. I love you, Lynn, I said softly, taking another step closer. She let a tiny moan escape her wide-open mouth, and I had to resist the urge to run. Her shoulders were starting to quiver, and her eyes grew as large as saucers. I crouched down so I could see her better and immediately saw the blood. Her hands were covered in it. They trembled more the closer I got, as if she was barely able to contain herself. Lynn, are you hurt? You're bleeding, I said. She bobbed her head again, her bloody fingers moving up and down, as if playing an invisible piano. They occasionally grazed her chin, leaving smears of blood on her skin. I wanted to recoil in disgust. The smell that was coming off of her was revolting. I could feel the vomit trying to climb up my throat. Her lips were dry and stretched thin, blood seeping between the cracks. I knew she wouldn't come out on her own, but I didn't want to leave her in the state she was in. I scooted closer and reached out to her. The excited hiccuping sounds got louder and her hands shook, fingers flexing. It was then that I could see the blood oozing from in between her fingers. Oh my God, Lynn. You're bleeding, I said. Instinctively I reached out to take her hand, but before I could even touch her, her hand sprang out towards me. A sharp pain shot through my arm, and I fell back on my ass. My arm burned, and I could see the blood dripping down onto the carpet. I looked back at her in shock and saw her grinning madly, her fingers clutching a large shard of glass. You all right in there? Chris asked from behind me. I turned my head slightly, and nodded to him, cradling my arm to my chest. When I turned back to face Lynn, I saw that her focus had shifted. She wasn't looking at me anymore. And she wasn't smiling anymore either. She was staring past me, her eyes glaring at Chris the way a hungry lion might stare at an antelope. Her mouth was still hanging open, but it was twisted into a snarl. I got to my feet, and began walking backwards down the hall, afraid to take my eyes off her. Are you bleeding? Chris asked. The moment the words left his mouth, Lynn started fast scooting out from under the bed, the glass shard still in her fist. Chris. Run. Go. I yelled. He must have been too afraid to move because a second later I felt my back bump into him. He was still standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the horror that was my wife. Lynn had crawled completely out from under the bed and stood in the bedroom doorway, her face twisted in rage. Her whole body was visibly tense. Blood ran down her fingers and onto the floor. Jesus, Lynn. Chris said, you, playing hide and seek. I reached back and pushed him towards the steps. Move your ass, Chris, I said as quietly but firmly as I could. Lynn bobbed her head in fast, sharp motions and began to grin, stretching her mouth open wider and wider so that her chin seemed to touch her chest. I heard Chris mutter a prayer and then he was running down the stairs. I stood at the top of the steps, stuck between the love for a woman who clearly needed serious help and self-preservation. I only want to help, I said, choking back tears. Her eyes focused on me once again as she slowly lifted the glass, holding it out in front of her. And then she started sprinting towards me, grinning with utter excitement. Thankfully my body took over and I flew down the stairs, skipping 2 or 3 at a time. I made it to the front door, before I felt her leap onto my back, wrapping her arms around my neck, her open mouth next to my ear, so that I could hear those terrible hiccuping sounds up close. I shook her off me, knocking her to the floor. I felt a searing pain in my back as she went, but I tore open the front door and bolted to my car. Chris was standing in the front yard, talking on the phone with the police. I didn't say a word, I just ran to my car and jumped in. Chris took the hint and followed me, still on the line with 911. I watched the rear-view mirror, sure I'd see her there, running after us. But I never did. I went straight to the ER and got 11 stitches in my arm and 3 on my back. The police asked a lot of questions and went back to the house to do a search, but of course, Lynn wasn't there. They advised me to stay with a friend or relative for a while and to file a restraining order as soon as I could, but none of those things would matter. Somehow I just knew. I dropped Chris off at home and went to a motel an hour away. I wanted to put as much distance between me and Lynn as I could. This is where I've been for the last 4 hours. I thought maybe the police would find her, maybe they'd get her the help she desperately needs. But now I don't think so. Because 40 minutes ago, I got a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words. I found you. And a picture attached. The picture was dark and grainy, but I instantly knew what it was. There was no mistaking my wife's eye. I started typing this out immediately after. I don't know what to do. I'm alone and scared, and I can't help but feel that I'm being watched. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe.